Hello, everyone. Today is Saturday, October 19th, 2019. I'm Bob Diebold, Vice Chairman of the Committee for the Global Endeavor. Today, we reconvene from a brief break to begin with Phase 5 and the 22nd webinar in our series of webinars on the topic, comparing and contrasting the true teachings of Jesus with the traditional tenets and practices of organized institutional Christianity. This is topic 8 in the study guide called Revelation Revealed. Neil Waldrop is the author and also the chairman of the committee. I am turning the webinar over to him now. Neil, over to you.
Thank you, Bob. It's a pleasure to be back with you again in this very interesting discussion. We indeed concluded our previous phase 4, on the 31st of August, so it's been approximately 1.5 months. And I would like to identify the underlying material to viewers who may not have been following our series. This is a series predicated on a long discussion document called Revelation Revealed, and specifically topic 8 of that document, which Bob identified for you earlier. If you have not done so already, I recommend that you download the document Revelation Revealed from the website of the Committee for the Global Endeavor. The citation is as follows: www.globalendeavor.net. I say again, www.globalendeavor.net. Global Endeavor is treated as a single word with no space or punctuation in the middle of it. For practical purposes today, we will actually be discussing a companion essay that I wrote in June. The essay is called Living the Real Religion of Jesus, and it is also available on the website of the Committee for the Global Endeavor. I think it is 3 links above the link for Revelation Revealed. Specifically, we will now start with page 2 of that essay. And I think for the purposes of following our discussion, it is really more important for you to have in hand the essay, Living the Real Religion of Jesus, than the major document, Revelation Revealed, because the essay consists of 18 pages and we will most certainly not finish it today. So I would again tell those who have been watching and others who have not been watching that there is no provision for asking questions during the broadcast, but as a substitute, we offer you the possibility of mailing us a question by email. And if you wish to do that, you would use the email address at the bottom of the web page of the Committee for the Global Endeavor, namely info@globalendeavor.net. In principle, your question should pertain to something that has happened or will happen on the program today, or perhaps ideas of yours that you have as you are watching the program. Of course, you may send us several questions. We reserve the right to edit your question if we decide to use it during a future broadcast. And if we do that, we would discuss the question on the basis of all participants, namely their views in regard to what you are asking, not simply my personal reactions. So now, without further ado, I would like to begin the body of our webinar today. And it is, as I indicated earlier, taken from page 2 of the essay, Living the Real Religion of Jesus. Specifically, we have now reached the second paragraph on the top of that page, page 2. And I would ask one of you to read that paragraph for us as a way of beginning the discussion. Stephen, would you be willing to do that, please? It begins, as we cooperate with, and so on.
As we cooperate with and seek to inspire numerous other human beings, we are also seeking to enhance and cooperate with God's presence within them, as well as his plans for their destiny and the destiny of our tumultuous and troubled planet, Urantia. None of these aspirations and efforts can conceivably be constrained or circumscribed by the doctrines or theological theories that swirl around God's children on Urantia as a consequence of the congealed authority that various exponents of religious tradition propound and proclaim. To the contrary, as the Midway Commission tells us, the religion of the Spirit consists in progressive revelation and ever beckons us on toward higher and holier achievements in spiritual ideals and eternal realities. That's from paper 155, section 6, paragraph 4.
Thank you, Stephen. In addition to the attribution from paper 155, I would point out that this quotation is part of Jesus's remarks on true religion, as embodied in that segment of paper 155. Now, the paragraph, in effect, has three components. The first sentence of the paragraph relates our personal experience to the experience of other human beings and to the destiny of our planet. The second paragraph distinguishes all of the above from doctrines and theories that emerge from traditional organized religion. And the third sentence mainly consists of the quotation whereby the Midwayers have given us a statement that Jesus makes about the religion of the Spirit. Andre, would you please give us your reactions to this paragraph, highlighting any part of it that you particularly want to call attention to?
Sure, Neil. And thank you for inviting me on the program again. This is a wonderful study. And what strikes me immediately is where you're referring to the contrast between what any particular organized religion could be requiring of its members versus what any human being in partnership with the God that indwells them could have as a plan for the outworking and the unfolding of their life here on earth, and how any conceivable human conception of what an individual could be doing pales by comparison to whatever the God that indwells us, the God on paradise that fragments himself and indwells us here on earth, may be carrying as a plan for each of us personally and individually. And that strikes me as being a remarkable concept to be bringing into focus for people, that God works individually with us and has a plan that begins here quite humbly with a view to outworking for us to all kinds of possibilities for high service. And I don't say high service by means of for any purpose of overblowing it, but rather the idea of becoming more and more serviceable to our fellows on earth and elsewhere as we obey the divine leadings. And there's the rub, isn't it? Since most of us do not hear the voice of God, nor are we encouraged necessarily to try to invent that we do hear the word of God in our minds, but we do definitely get some kinds of leadings. The rub is, to what extent are we really able to follow this divine plan? How difficult or how easy is it really? And how do we determine what the next right step is for us in this life?
Thank you. I appreciate very much your insights into this. And now I'm going to turn to Doreen and ask her to address one of the implications that you just gave us, Andre, namely the relationship between the idea of progressive revelation inside us as part of our experience and our interactions with other human beings for God's purposes. Doreen, would you take a look at that one?
Sure. I was looking at as the first sentence, to inspire numerous other human beings who are also seeking to enhance and cooperate with God's presence within them. Well, you can't cooperate until you recognize God's presence within your own self. So the relationship has to be established first. And then the closer, I believe the closer that you are the insight with the thought adjuster, the deeper you go, the more you get to understand the leadings of the Spirit. And it is a profound thing because it transcends yourself. It becomes not just serving them, the idea of service, which is a wonderful idea. Many people do that. But it's an understanding of the spirituality of the nature of serving them. And that you are, I guess, connecting with their thought adjuster, the spirit within them. And through that, it seems to lead you to, it led me to many places. And, I could pontificate about a lot of other stuff, but I had so much experiences with that, not knowing necessarily that what was leading me and not understanding it, but I knew there was a powerful urge. There was something that kept pushing me forward in deeper and deeper experiences. And that, of course, you can't keep things to yourself. It opens up, the social graces where you engage other people. You just can't help it. It's like you become so full and you have to share it. And so when you find people that are receptive and trying to understand also their existence, because that's what leads you to find God. Many people have found God, but it isn't the idea of finding God. It was understanding God. It was, to me, such a deeper level where what is it that he wants from me? Or what can I do? But that was truly how I understood it, a very slow progression over many decades of inner growth, struggle, conflict, which brings you again to recognize that in other people. So when I was led truly by the Spirit to other people, it was because they probably recognized something that I could offer them, and I recognized the need in them because I had it and I went through it. And when you experience something, it's, of course, it's easier to know. And over the years, and it's been a miraculous journey, and I can't talk about traditional religion, as you well know, because I had none. And so I was fresh coming into this created imaginary being in my mind to confer with. And that was to me how I understood how God led me, not knowing even there was a God, but I was still led. So the Spirit is pretty powerful. As I commiserated with that invisible being, that I could pour my heart out into because there was no one else to listen. And it was that trust and confidence that you find, that security, especially as a child, in something greater than yourself. And of course, God is always ready.
Thank you, Doreen. I agree that you came into all these questions as a fresh observer, as a fresh experience that was not prejudged by what traditional religion had told you. I'm not sure, though, I would apply to you personally the adjective fresh. I would have trouble saying that you're fresh. At least I don't think I would want to say that. But in turn, I'd like to ask Bob to perhaps add to whatever he intends to say anyway, a question that I would like to pose to him now. In effect, there is a contrast between the first and two sentences. The first sentence here talks about the relationship of the individual in part to other human beings and the destiny of our planet. The second sentence talks about the constrained doctrines and theological theories of traditional religion. It seems to me that traditional religion has not done much with the affirmative duty to contribute to the growth of society in our planet, whereas, of course, we do know that that is involved. Why do you think there is a gap?
Very interesting, Neil. Let me start responding to this one this way. I've just within the last 2 weeks, I've experienced the most ironies of ironies, I think directly related to this entire paragraph. In preparing for this webinar, I kind of went back because we've had such a long interlude, almost a month. So I listened to the last 30 minutes or so of our discussion, and we talked about this first paragraph. I'm sorry, about the first sentence in the paragraph. And Marvin and Doreen raised the issue of our troubled planet. Marvin specifically talked to the fact that that the religions of authority appear to be consequential to the fact that people are committing suicide and having great troubles. It's in his wheelhouse to be able to know that. So he speaks with some pretty good authority, and I kind of listened to that. To talk about the irony about all of this since our 21st webinar, at the place where I'm consulting, which is a military installation, one of the leaders of a product team committed suicide. While at the same time, there was a second colleague who has been fighting for his life and has been in and out of hospitals and just passed away. Quite two of the extremes, I would say. Taking a look at this idea, this gap that you first asked for me to address, I probably was going to address that anyway. I didn't really see it as that sort of thing. But the first sentence talks about, and this is what we did last webinar, is that we talked a lot about cooperating with the thought adjuster, God's presence within our human being, with our fellow human beings. And then the second sentence almost is the paradox I was going to bring up. I think you kind of had that in the premise in your question. And it was that that the religion of the spirit, which each individual has, or has the ability to have because of our constellation of spiritual advisors and helpers, with the spiritual nucleus that we have in our mind of the thought adjuster that Andre brought up. But the second sentence then talks about, you bring up the idea that, this can't be constrained. So I'll throw the paradox out now. As I was, I must say that the suicide has created an extreme impact, on the organization, as you might well, might well surmise. Walking out with one of the colleagues last week, and he made an interesting statement. He said, there must not have been a lot of communication going on with the individual that created suicide. And the man upstairs, I think is what he said. And I said, boy, that's a real profound statement. I said, because I think you're really right about that. So here's the paradox. Last webinar, as I just said, we talked, I think at length about the troublesome part of our planet, where we are today, and secular totalitarianism, which we had a couple of webinars on, and strongly talked discussed, I should say, the fact that most professed religionists are unwitting secularists. So the paradox is this: are the religions of authority actually constraining the communication, the personal communication with the individual to the man upstairs, to God the Father Infinite? I think so. The individual that took his life, there were no indications, but there obviously, as his daughter gave a partial talk. She was only 16, and she said that my father must have had some demons that she didn't even know about. So very interesting. The gap, as you say, Neil, or as you put in your premise of the question, and the juxtaposition between the fact that all humans since Pentecost of normal mind, have the ability to gain spiritual insight and to have a religion of the spirit, as the Midway Commission quote there says. So I throw that back and say that I was going to talk about that anyway. I think that you nailed what was kind of interesting to me here. I don't think I have an answer to that, but I think that the religions, contrary to what the second sentence is, I think that their religions of authority can circumscribe and can constrain individuals to the degree to which we see these things happening. Back over to you.
Thank you, Bob. I'd like to follow up with Stephen. Do you regard these teachings of traditional religion really having the effect of constraining or circumscribing the personal relationship with God? Or do you think that that is too facile and too general a statement, that in other instances, the religions of authority, the religions of tradition may actually foster a relationship with God? Stephen, you're muted at the moment.
It's a complex question. I would say to start that human aspirations and efforts can be constrained and circumscribed by traditional organized religion. However, divine aspirations and efforts cannot be. And that goes for the cosmic dimension of divine efforts, and also the inner, let's call them spiritual aspects of divine efforts. So the answer is yes and no. If you're only talking about human aspirations and efforts, of course they can be constrained and circumscribed. That's because we're human, and we get in our own way all the time. However, it's clear from the Urantia book and also from the Bible that God is able to take evil and is able to take catastrophe and make, to be really superficial, to make lemonade out of lemons. That is part of what God does with evil in the universe, and with sin and iniquity in the universe. And the classic example of that, of course, is the Lucifer rebellion, where we're told that much more good will come out of the rebellion than ever did evil. So if you're just talking about human level, yes. Divine level, I would agree with that, but you didn't specify that. So I think you have to be more specific and say divine aspirations and efforts cannot be constrained or circumscribed. Anyway, what Bob said about his colleague there and the presumed lack of communication with God having to do with his suicide, I think that's an unwarranted and unfair assumption. Many times suicide, depression, whatever, is caused by biochemical alterations and imbalances in the brain. And a person can be extremely spiritually close to God and also very depressed at the same time. Mother Teresa is a good example of that. So I think it's very unfair to this man or to anybody to say, oh, well, he must have been separated from God to commit suicide. We are afflicted by physical diseases and mental diseases, and both of those can affect our spiritual state, even though our spiritual state is healthy, but it just has burdens. We have burdens that sometimes we cannot handle in our lives. So I would just warn against those kinds of presumptions about evil that happens to anybody, whether it's physical or psychological. The story of Job in the Bible, of course, is a classic example of his friends attributing God's punishment to him because of the bad things that befell him in his life. This is kind of a modern a permutation of that somehow he was being punished for not being close to God, and so he committed suicide. So I just think we have to be careful about that sort of thing.
Thank you. I take your point, and I'm sure that Bob accepts it too. I would ask you now, if you are willing to continue this discussion, to comment on the relationship of three phrases that appear in that relatively short quotation by the Midweir Commission. The three phrases are, in the second line, progressive revelation, and then in the third line, spiritual ideals and eternal realities. This is interesting in the sense that it implies, I think, or maybe even states very specifically, that revelation is both an ideal and a reality. Would you look at those words for us, please?
Me?
Yes, please.
Oh, okay. Well, in talking about progressive revelation, it reminded me, I also wanted to comment on what you said about traditional organized religion not having any, you said something like positive input into our planetary civilization. You said something along those lines.
Well, you're close. What I said was that it didn't focus on that very much.
Yeah, so I disagree with that. I mean, the Urantia book states that one of the main functions of religion, organized religion, is number one, to conserve our moral values and moral capital, and to build a basis for the progression of moral and ethical values. Traditional religion also serves as a basis for progressive revelation. Without any conservation of moral values and spiritual wisdom, however attenuated in organized religion, there would be no basis for epical revelation, including the Urantia book, including the life and teachings of Jesus. So I think to dismiss traditional organized religion in that way is just wrong. And so progressive revelation depends on traditional organized religion for it to exist. As far as spiritual ideals and eternal realities, they can only exist within a human context. So no ideal can exist without an existential framework. And eternal realities only exist on this planet in terms of our time-limited, space and time understanding. So both ideals and eternal realities can exist on this planet in attenuated form within us and without us in this form of organized religion.
Thank you. Andre, I would like to seek your interpretation of a slightly different element of that same quotation from the remarks of Jesus. Specifically, the first few words, the religion of the Spirit consists in progressive revelation. Please comment on the idea of revelation. If it is associated with the religion of the Spirit, it seems to me unlikely that we could limit that phrase progressive revelation to epical revelation or written texts, and indeed that it is a much broader concept. What do you say?
I would agree with you, Neil, that in fact it couldn't possibly be limited to any strictly epical phenomenon. That's easily illustrated in the case of all five of us here, in that in order to have accepted an epical revelation, namely the Urantia book in this case, we had to have gotten to a point in our life that we could recognize such a revelation as having value, having truth. And that only happens, as in my experience, as a result of having been on a quest of some kind. In my own case, I was given good moral precepts by my mother and was reared in the Catholic Church. And in moving through life, it was already something important to me that I had a relationship with God. The fact that plenty of answers did not get answered for me, and I'll try not to deviate from the purpose of your question, but the idea is that progressive revelation on this planet, whether it happens because you find an epical revelation or because in most people's cases, they experience some auto-revelational leadings of their thought adjuster, not hearing voices necessarily, not doing any of that. I don't think most of us hear voices, but very often when confronted with two paths of conduct, one may feel slightly preferential to somebody who's paying attention to a moral imperative within themselves and makes that choice, not always making the right choice sometimes, but in making a choice, we find ourselves on a road that if we're sincere and paying attention, there is a redirect that occurs somehow internally or very often externally. And we can all think of examples in our life where that might have occurred. And I think of the fact that I wouldn't have found the Urantia book except for the fact that I was very hungry for answers and very hungry for wanting to discover truth as I understood it, even as a youngster and a young adolescent. And so that cannot be happening solely by the decisions I'm making. It can only be happening because I'm having some kind of an influence in my life. And that influence would be how you characterized it, you know, in the initial phrasing, or shall I say how Jesus did. You know, the religion of the Spirit consists in progressive revelation. The relationship I have with my thought adjuster is how I understand it as a result of revelation, but it was simply my relationship with God before I found the Urantia book. And there was an interplay that was happening there. And that's what we perhaps need to somehow learn about more, is the dynamics of that interplay, how it occurs, how showing up sincerely will lead to a place where new decisions can occur that take one up a notch from where one was before. And in that would constitute some kind of progression if it allows us to interact and be a better person with our fellows somehow.
Thank you, Doreen. I believe that what Andre just said, and likewise the intent of my question, suffices to establish that this phrase progressive revelation is not simply words on paper. It is not simply the text of the Urantia book, but a spiritual experience that probably can be understood to be interior and individual. Do you agree with that? Would you comment?
That was the whole journey for me, was internal spiritual experience. Otherwise, I didn't know anything was real, but I was continually led to make certain decisions, not knowing if it was right or wrong. I just didn't even question it. It was instinct. Do this, go here, you'll find what you need. And I did, and I found, because I was always searching, of course, you know, I'm just trying to understand. I didn't even know God was real. I said I made it up, but I had no information other than that. And of course, as you grow older, people talk about it, so you call him God, that's fine. But I was led to go to, maybe I told you the story before, but to an institute of spiritual development. And there I found, because something in me said, go to this town. And I did, and I went to this town and I took dancing lessons, thinking I would find somebody there who knew of something, you know, spiritual that I could, or religious, that, you know, I could understand. And I couldn't find it. And then right across the hall from the dance studio was this, about 2 feet away, this institute sign came up, and I closed the door one, entered the other, and that they told me there is a life after death and there is a world of spirit and all that stuff. I had no idea. I thought you just live and die and it's over. Nevertheless, at some point in the teachings there, and I started to teach the Urantia book there as well when I first got it. Not that I knew what I was talking about, but I loved it, so I had to share it. Nevertheless, I'll continue quickly because everything is a story with me. I asked somebody if they could teach something on God. You know, tell me about, what do you know about God? I wanted to know what people thought about him. And they said, why don't you do it? And I said, I never had any formal religion. I can't talk about, but do it anyway. And of course, push came to shove, and I did. And when I took all these books out of the library, about 15 books, and, you know, many saints and, well, philosophers, one of the books I was reading, it was Descartes. And I used to, when I read, I have to close my eyes and let it sink in, like meditate. And it, as I'm reading, and thinking and closing my eyes and thinking what he said, all of a sudden, a vision came across my eyes, like a tape that you see on the bottom of the screen today, of information in French. And it said, not that I knew what it said, but I wrote down as quickly as I could what it said and took it to work. And I asked for a translation, and somebody said, you will be born again. And the following week, I found the Urantia book. And truly God, and my point is to tell you how God knows exactly how to get through to you, how to lead you, you know, that thought adjust. It was incredible, because everything I started to recognize, this was my destiny. And then you start to trust, and you realize somebody does have your interest at heart. And of course, it's greater than yourself. Therefore, I kept continuing, oh my God, and you're saying growing the revelation. Well, you have to have enough depth and understanding to have more revealed to you. It just doesn't happen, because it would go probably right over my head. So the internal life became very powerful. And as you internalize what you're finding and connecting to, I had to understand, how does this work? Because I started to read about how things happen. And of course, it was exactly as the Urantia book talks about. Things are revealed to you. No, I never heard voices. I have to say that. I didn't have that gift, but I did have the gift of sight. When the thought adjuster thought it was necessary for me to know and see certain things. And that's it. And I never did anything with it except it's personal. And it really helped me to live and further my relationship with the spirit. And of course, you know, with the other, I just lost my train of thought, not the train of thought, the word, with the other agencies, you know, of the Mother Spirit, which acted on the outside. So I had both operating at the same time. And that really, I wouldn't be where I was. I could have been on the streets. My background was horrific, but something in me would not let me fail. And I knew it. And I'm a stubborn person. And so I had that courage, and it really took courage to just go beyond what anybody, my family, anybody knew. I never discussed anything with any of them because nobody was interested in what I was interested. So I had a private life, and I did not socialize that. The only thing I socialized was the teachings of the book, of course, when that came along. So if that's the question you're asking me, it's the depth of insight. You cannot progress, with more revelation unless you have the capacity to understand what you're being led to do and socialize it.
Thank you. You answered my question, and of course, quite a few that you added to it, which was very helpful and useful. So please do not consider that a criticism. I was simply saying that you answered my question and went well beyond it. Thank you. Bob, I'd like you to wrap up this discussion, or at least conclude it, by examining 3 words in the brief quotation from Jesus. And those 3 words are all of them nouns. The word spirit in the second line, the word ideals in the third line, and the word realities also in the third line. How does spirit relate to ideals, and how does it relate to realities? Would you say that ideals are predominantly a mind matter, whereas realities are not so closely identified with mind and may be something in addition?
That's a pretty heavy philosophical question, Neil. I'm going to attempt to answer that. Let me just follow up with the one thing that Steve brought up, and I think as I usually do, concur with what he was saying, that we should be careful on this whole idea of suicide and whether there really was spirit, God conscious communication going on. I thoroughly agree with that. I certainly don't want to make that a thing. It could be a separate study unto itself. And yeah, I thought I'd bring it up only because it happened and because we discussed it toward the end of our last webinar. However, the idea of affliction is a very interesting study also. And I'll just say very briefly that I think that affliction, the Moda statement that it is the worst affliction never to have been afflicted, and our definition of what affliction is could vary from from the sublime to the very practical. But I think it takes us through thing, meaning, and value, and that takes me to the response to your question here. Being that we really don't know exactly what spirit is, it's at once a substance, it's a concept. We talk of, here's a spiritual as an adjective with spiritual ideals. We, by faith, we accept the spirit, that the spirit level exists, matter, mind, spirit, and the 2 new revelations. I'm saying they're new revelations, which is personality, that is the reality in the universe, and Morantia, which is the intervening substance and philosophical area between matter and spirit. So there's a lot going on here. I've always perceived the idea of our superconscious, which is where the thought adjuster works to develop and spiritualize, that the papers use both those words, our thoughts. The highest level values, those such as loyalty, altruism, I think the thought adjuster works in a constant basis to be able to enhance and draw them from our superconscious to make them obvious to our soul. Our conscious decisions, decisions are those moral events that we create internally and can execute externally to actually produce these spiritual fruits. So my idea of spirit is pretty much laden in this idea of cosmic value. What actually has value to the cosmos. It could be matter, mind, or spirit, but in most cases, I should say in all cases, the thought adjuster has to work in our superconscious, our subconscious, our conscious, our superconscious. The papers in the personality section talk a lot about the superconscious, and that's a very little written subject. If you go out and Google superconscious, you won't get terribly much on that. This is a concept that the Urantia papers, I believe, present to us and really push our cosmic consciousness much further out than before we had actually been introduced to the Urantia papers. So to get to those three nouns, and actually spiritual is an adjective in that sentence, but spiritual can be a noun. I think an idea is an ideal that has been promoted to something that can be action. A reality is something that will never be, that is eternal. We're told that the Father is a reality. The first source and center as the Father infinite is real because he is personality, and anything that has personality is real in the universe. Anything that will be sustained eternally will be real in the universe. For those personalities who are extinguished by the ancients of days for whatever reason, not fusing with an adjuster or not making, they lose the ability to be realities in the universe. So pretty heavy philosophical things here, Neil, and I don't want to take up too much time, but I hope that I got to at least cover the areas that you expected to cover with that question.
Well, Bob, I will assure you, as I indeed assured Doreen previously, that you have addressed the question that I asked and have added to it. So well done. I believe further that what we are doing is exchanging insights as best we can on the understanding that our mission is to demonstrate pluralism and diversity. There is no single answer. There is no one right way of interpreting the material. The material is indeed profound. So now I think I should draw a line under this paragraph, which actually is the final paragraph in the first section of my essay, namely the section, Finding God for Oneself. And we will continue on with the next section of the essay after addressing this formal question that you can think of as a transition to the next section. But this formatting on the page corresponds to formal questions that are the business of members of this panel to talk about. And I would ask Andre to read the formal question, question A. And I tell you, Andre, you're getting a benefit by reading it because you will not be the first to answer it. So others will have to swing at the question before I call upon you, even though you are going to read it for us, please.
Very kind, Neil. We all accept the goal of finding God for ourselves. How shall we do this? Do you believe that there are many possible approaches? And if so, what factors lead you to this conclusion? What steps do you recommend, at least as possible contributions to a personal progression that may be stimulating and inspiring?
Thank you, Andre. Well, Stephen, I gave the advantage to Andre by asking him to read it. I'm going to give you the disadvantage of being the first to reply.
Okay. Well, as I've said before, I have a bit of trouble with the way you have phrased the idea of we all, actually, I disagree with the statement, we all accept the goal of finding God for ourselves. I objected to that wording before, and I still do. For me, it's much more resonant to say, we all accept the goal of finding God in ourselves for others. We all accept the goal of finding God in ourselves, but it's for others. It's not for ourselves. We can only find God in ourselves as much as we serve others. So I would just put it that way for myself anyway. And as far as steps, well, obviously there are many approaches and different ways of doing this. What I put down for myself is the personal pursuit of truth, beauty, and goodness in one's life is what can generate the inspiration in one's life and the love of God and the love of other people in one's life in order to motivate the serving of others. So if you generate enough spiritual capital, let's call it, in your life by pursuing truth, beauty, and goodness, that serves as fuel for the service to others. And that is the fruits of the Spirit. So you might call the inspiration spirit and service to others as fruits of the Spirit. And for me, that is all generated by a pursuit of truth, beauty, and goodness in various ways and forms. But finding God in ourselves for others. I would prefer to phrase it like that.
I understand your point. I think if you will permit, I will explain the intention of my wording for ourselves. I'm not trying to ask, I'm not predicating the idea that we are finding God solely for our own purposes. What I was trying to say for ourselves is basically to imply as an effort by ourselves for our own purposes, an effort that we will undertake individually and for that matter in groups too, but not simply solely to benefit ourselves. That interpretation of the sentence is not what I meant. Bob, having listened to Stephen and indeed to Andre, who read the question, you are now in line to give your answer.
Okay. There's a number of questions in here. Would you like me to tackle all of them or just kind of broadly hit all of them, touch upon them?
I leave that to you. You may do whatever you wish.
Okay. Well, the premise in the question is, first that we would accept the goal of finding God for ourselves. And then, how to do it. Are there many approaches? And why do I think there might be? And what steps would I recommend? I think in a time sense, one has to find God before one can augment and helping others find God if they haven't found God, or to even generate their enthusiasm, to generate their emotional, spiritual help to be able to think about maybe finding God. I had said previously last week that I don't think there's ever been a time when I didn't believe I needed to find God. I just always accepted. Not exactly sure how that happened or why it happened, but I just can't remember any time when I didn't think that there was a God and that he was a personality. So I think in time one has to find God. I do want to point out something that I sort of alluded to in the last session, and that was that there's 3 quotes that only show up from Jesus, and it's this it's this idea that that we will. Well, here, let me just read it first. The very first one is Jesus talking to the apostles about truly, if they want to find God. He's at Syracuse, and they spent a full week there. It's a long paragraph, so I'll just read the statement that I find pertinent here. He says, if you truly want to find God, that desire is in itself evidence that you have already found him. Your trouble is not that you cannot find God, for the Father has already found you. Your trouble is simply that you do not know God. The other one was earlier. I'm not exactly sure where this occurred, but he says, again to the apostles, you are my apostles, and to your religion religion shall not become a theologic shelter to which you may flee in fear of facing the rugged realities of spiritual progress and idealistic adventure. And now here's the point that I'm going to make here. But this is the part that's underlined. But rather shall your religion become the fact of the real experience which testifies that God has found you. And I'll stop there. So I pondered this thought that Jesus said to the apostles twice, and he did it a third time actually, that you'll begin to find God when God has, it's evidence that God has already found you. So I said to myself, I said, well, why would the infinite Father need to find a human? I mean, he knows where we are. He knows every hair on our head. He's provided us a personality at some point, which is not known. There's a lot of speculation among Urantia readers as to at what moment, and they start from the zygote all the way to the pre-thought adjuster invasion as to when personality is bestowed. So he's got that. And of course, then the thought adjuster, which then invades the mind at some point prior to 6 years old, at least on Urantia. So you knew where we were to begin with. So, what does Jesus really mean when he's saying that you will begin to find God because God's already found you? And I've come to this conclusion. Thankfully, from my friend Ken Kaiser up there in Chicago, who we went back and forth on email about this idea. And the word "found" has a number of definitions, and one of them is like the foundry. It's building the foundation. And I think that's probably the way to look at this: is that the Father has built the foundation, not only with the entire cosmos, to be able to be a personality, but personality and then the thought adjuster in that sequence of events also. So this idea that the Father has found us is kind of like, and I'll use a metaphor now, the phone line. The Father's built the infrastructure. So in 21st century, well, maybe not 21st century, 19th and 20th century metaphor, I can use the phone as an example. He's built the infrastructure. When the personality arrives, it's the infrastructure is built, the wires are up, the poles are there, the phone is there, but it doesn't ring until the thought adjuster comes, and it rings, and I need to, as an individual who now has moral discernment, I've made a moral choice and decision, and I've acted on it. I need to pick up the phone, and it's ringing, and that's when the communication is now bidirectional. I think the communication probably is unidirectional until that actually happens. So this idea of finding God is a process. It's a bidirectional process, and it starts with the thought adjuster. I may have that process somewhat wrong, but that's my perception of the way this happens. And so how shall we do this? Well, Well, let me go to the last part of that. What steps do I recommend? I don't think there's anything in the Urantia papers that is either prescriptive or proscriptive, meaning that I think the papers teach using either strong opinion in certain cases, such as the atonement concept, or providing facts, or providing a large cosmology, which is the scaffolding for which we can then basically apply a spiritual insight into. So I wouldn't prescribe anything myself based upon the way that happens. I don't think that anytime anyone tries to provide prescription or proscription in a religious sense, I think we run to the slippery slope of dogma and doctrine, and I would stay away from that. But there are approaches, and I will hold those off for a follow-up if I could do that, because I've kind of said a lot about this already. So let me throw it back to you, Neil, and I may want a little follow-up following this.
Thank you. I simply need to clarify your final request. Do you mean that you would like me to come back to you before I conclude discussion on this question?
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you. Doreen, there have been quite a few words exchanged since the time that Andre read the question. So to refresh your memory of the question, I'd like to read it out again as a repetition. A, we all accept the goal of finding God for ourselves. How shall we do this? Do you believe that there are many possible approaches? And if so, what factors lead you to this conclusion? What steps do you recommend, at least as possible contributions to a personal progression that may be stimulating and inspiring?
Thank you. Yeah, there was a lot of things said, takes you in many directions. But yes, as I mentioned earlier previously, I found God. There was no doubt in my mind. But how shall we do this? Well, you know, when you read, I have read a great deal of stuff over the years, of course. And number one, it's being in constant communion. I looked at Jesus, how he was continually talking to God. And it's like any relationship. How do you find the relationship? You have to commune with the being. And even if you can't see him, I knew within myself that he was real. So I always talked to him, not all day long, but pretty much until I found the method, of course, and that was through yoga. I found the meditation. And that balance, you know, it balances your energies. There's a harmony. And it took me months and months, I would say close to a year before I was successful. And I sat down and because I had a bad back, I have to lay down. So like Steve, but I just said, I tried all these things, God, I tried music and and all these ohms and all that other stuff that I've read about. Nothing is working. Dear God, just tell me about yourself. I want to know you. And boom, it was as if that was the key that opened the doorway. And in an instant, it was amazing transformation that it was like the third eye opened up and I saw this inner world. And it was a beautiful Hindu woman with the dot in the middle. And then in seconds, she disappeared. But that was the beginning. So therefore, okay, there was a window that you have to enter into it. It's not easy to want to know God. But then as I continued over the years, of course, it got better and deeper and more beautiful. There's nothing you could put words to, but God did tell me about his nature. And he did, or he or she, it didn't matter. It's beyond gender for me. And I grew more deeper into the spiritual relationship, of course. And, when your mind is yielded to spirit, it becomes increasingly spiritual. And the opposite, again, is true. So it was the union of the greater and the lesser coming together. And how you do it, I would say you have to focus your mind total on one point, and that is why people cannot perhaps have the ability to pay attention for any length of time and to persist on focusing, because your mind wanders into many things. But when I had the conversation, that helped me to direct my attention, like I'm speaking to you, I'm not thinking of anyone else. So that really was the impetus to open up this whole world, is that focusedness. And, and the down grasp came, and that's the spiritual pull. So what happens also, when you talk about other people? Well, it's like-minded people attract like-minded people. So the spirit in them is attracted to the spirit in you and vice versa. So therefore, it's like you tend to be pulled in a direction where you could do and understand what this is all about. And that is really, it's the gravity force of the spirit that's doing the work, and you're just paying attention to it. That's how I understood. But you can find God in nature. Jesus went up on top of the mountain. Wherever it's quiet, wherever you could find that peace inside yourself, so you could tune in and tune out everything else. And it becomes very habit forming. And I used to do it all the time, even at work. 10 minutes. I mean, once you get the hang of it, you don't stop, because that is a very strong spiritual pull. And I can go in my office for just 15 minutes and refresh. It's not a depth, it's just like that harmony within. It lifts up that negative energies or, the burden of everyday life, and it refreshes you. And therefore, it doesn't matter anymore whether you're in deep communion with God, but there are levels and deeper levels and just surface levels, but you have to begin somewhere. And that's where it doesn't matter, as long as you find a place of peace and harmony where you could really have that opportunity without interruption. So I think that's the steps to simulate, and it's extraordinary. I mean, I won't go into all the extraordinary, inspiring things, but connecting with the Spirit of God, oh my God. Oh my God. There's nothing more inspiring and fabulous than that. There's nothing in the world that's greater than that relationship. And I have never gotten to any place where I could say that was, it's a continual growth. But, even if I'm at whatever level, it's irrelevant to me. It doesn't matter. It's the relationship that is so secure and so cemented. That's what I call my faith. Nothing could ever interfere, take it away. Nobody could do anything to say anything that would make me change my mind, anything at all. So it's truly the most beautiful relationship one can have.
Thank you, Doreen. I'd like to ask for a little bit of follow-up here in terms of your description. I believe at some point you talked about focusing or focusing on. Now, as a comparison to the words of a traditional framework, which are prayer and meditation, where would you put your words focus on? Is it prayer, or is it meditation, or is it a mixture of both?
No, total meditation. Prayer, I could do that. I didn't have to, be silent. You could pray anywhere. I always talk to God, so maybe I asked him, to help me, and that was prayer, or to help someone else, things like that. But it was the step of meditation, which they talk about in the Urantia book as well. It becomes very habit forming, and that's what it did. And it saved my life. It kept me normal and sane and happy and balanced for the most part, and grew me, which is another area, and humbled me and tortured me, but he didn't forsake me.
Thank you for that explanation. In addition, I appreciate it very much. Andre, you have now listened to all of your colleagues elaborate. Perhaps they have given you some additional idea, but in any case, it is your turn to answer the question as best you may.
Well, thank you. And I appreciate the softball, because now the second question becomes very easy and succinct. Do you believe that there are many possible approaches? And if so, what factors lead you to this conclusion? The answer is yes. And all the sharing that came before leads me to that conclusion. They're all different approaches. And if they're all different approaches with just these three, and I'm sure you have a different approach as well, Neil, and I have a different approach, or an approach that has some elements of everybody's approach, perhaps. But what steps do you recommend, at least as possible contributions to a personal progression? What I recommend primarily is, first of all, starting to look if you haven't done so. And that's obviously not true of anybody here. Everybody here began looking a long, long time ago. The bigger question for all of us, having found the Urantia book, is, are we still looking? And how are we looking? I don't mean, are we looking for another Urantia book? We won the lottery once. We don't need to win it again. But it is about next steps. It is about what is the next right thing in the microcosm, and in the macrocosm, it is about what is God's will for my life going forward. So just to maybe drill down and put some image to it, similar to some people, I had many of these questions, and I took certain steps. I was seeking different things. I narrowly escaped getting into a mind cult that presented itself, and thankfully people were very sincere in their fanaticism, and that repelled me sufficiently that I was able to realize that was not for me, like immediately, that kind of thing. But having had a couple of experiences like that, once with a mind cult, once with a material cult, which was very, very similar. It just happened to be focused on material things instead of mind things. The next thing that I came upon was wanting to learn to meditate. And transcendental meditation was coming on the scene at the time. And I decided, okay, well, am I willing to put my money where my mouth is? At the time, it was only $60. It kept increasing in price astronomically from there, and had been a little cheaper earlier on, but I took advantage of the $60 fee, got a mantra from somebody, and started meditating. The interesting thing about that, and how it resonates with some decisions that people make. Doreen suggested that one prayer seemed to open a door, and I would suggest that probably it was that prayer with all that preceded that prayer. And in the same way, all that preceded my looking, I started exploring reincarnation at age 13 because a Barbadian poet, or a Barbadian Canadian poet, talked about reincarnation in his poetry. And I asked him about his poetry. That's what he said it was. And that was enough for me to start exploring. But it was only a month after I started practicing transcendental meditation that, having found my friend in high school and having philosophical conversations on the way home, he said, hey, my brother gave me this book that claims to be written by angels. I said, oh yeah? And followed him home. And that was the beginning of my love affair with the revelation. The thing is, the point of bringing it up in this context is, there were many steps ahead of that led. There were many decisions to forsake some things and to choose other things that led in that direction. Now, it's not all about finding the Urantia book. Most people of the 7.6, and we're now officially, as of probably a month ago, at 7.6 billion people on this earth, are not going to find the Urantia book in this next generation. The vast, vast majority are not. But everybody, practically everybody, as far as we're concerned, because we're not in the business of judging people, have a thought adjuster. And the question is, what can they do to further their life along? And in the first place, my recommendation would be to, if you haven't begun searching, search. If you have begun searching, what seems to be the next right thing for you to do to up your game, to take it to the next level? And for many people, it might be to join, as Stephen has aptly, suggested, many people are going to find this in the institutions that are out there, whether they be Christian, Jewish, Muslim, it doesn't matter if that's appropriate for their walk. But the next thing is, are you trying to establish your own personal relationship with God? And that to me seems to be the how shall we do this? The how shall we do this? There has to be an element of establishing personal relationship with God in whatever context that you're choosing to take the next step toward God. And there always needs to be, having taken a step, a willingness to take another step.
Thank you. I believe that your remarks are sufficient for me to generalize on the basis of what everyone has said. I think all of you in one way or another have said that finding God will happen after you begin looking, that you will not find God unless you are looking for God, unless you are searching for God. And there have been different ways of expressing that, but it seems to me that all of you have said that an active process of searching for God is a step that leads to finding God. And I totally agree with that. Bob, you've asked for a return trip here.
Yeah, I wanted to hit that middle part there, and I'm glad that Andre brought up this idea of choosing. The part that I left out was, do you believe there are many possible approaches, and if so, what factors lead you to this conclusion? As Andre said, as everybody said, yes, there's many approaches. However, I think there is one general pattern that seems to make sense that the Midwayers have spoken about. And it's this idea that the human mind does not create values, but the human mind can discover, recognize, interpret, and choose. And I brought up the idea of this choice. I think a really good example of this is when the child makes that moral decision. It's based upon the fact that moral discernment has been percolating in the individual for some time. And if you think about how that has to occur, and the child has to have these experiences where they finally discover the difference between good and bad, between moral and not moral. They have to recognize it when it occurs. When it does occur, they have to interpret that and then make a choice as to what to do. And at some point, that child will then make that moral choice, moral decision, and actually act upon it. And because we have the spirit of truth, one of the few planets that's at this stage that would have it, we now have everyone that of normal mind has an invasion of the thought adjuster, which begins this further quest for finding the Father Infinite that won't end until we actually attain Him on paradise. So that was the thought that I wanted to put out there. And by the way, that phrase is in paper 196, the absolute last paper. And I did have to, one other quick thought about that. It's 196, 310. And then the sentence after that, or the paragraph after that, does really address how we might approach helping others find God. It says that the moral choice of I should say that the Midway Commission writes, the moral values of the universe become intellectual possessions by the exercise of three basic judgments or choices of the mortal mind: moral choice, ethical choice, and religious choice. It's just my thought about all of this is that if there is an approach to help others to try and if they're in the finding God mode, and even if they're not, is to build these superconscious values of moral, ethical, and religious choices in them. And frankly, I think that's what our celestial helpers tend to help us do, put us in situations that actually create the environment for us to make these type of choices. Back over to you, Neil. Thanks.
Thank you, Bob. Since I gave Bob a second trip to the batter's box, I would now like to offer the same opportunity to the rest of you, Doreen, Stephen, and Andre. And if any of you wishes to speak, then please raise your hand or do whatever you need to do to get my attention. Stephen?
Yeah, I just wanted to propose a sort of a framework for understanding or interpreting what people have said in their own different ways in terms of personal progression into spirit values. One way of thinking about it is that we can start out with belief, which we might think of as cognitive or intellectual in certain propositions or ideas. So belief would be an introductory level. And from belief, if we internalize that to enough of a degree, we can attain to what I would call faithfulness. So faithfulness includes faith, it includes belief, but it is much more existential or experiential. In other words, you're able to take your beliefs in certain ideas and really implement them and embody them in your life on a daily basis in a faithful way to the will of God in your life. So we have from belief to faithfulness to what might be called loyalty. And loyalty is the consistent practice of faithfulness. And loyalty can be understood, I mean, that's a word that the Urantia book uses, and they often combine it with the word cosmic. So we have cosmic loyalty to God in a exterior sense, but also internal loyalty to God, which you might call spiritual loyalty. And Jesus, for example, was somebody who was able to exhibit cosmic loyalty to God's plan in a objective way, so to speak, or an external way, but also internal loyalty to God. And those two, of course, have to go together. You can't have one without the other. So that's just a sort of a heuristic framework for understanding different ways that people can grow towards God.
Thank you, Stephen. This now leads me to ask whether either Doreen or Andre or both want a second chance. Doreen?
Yeah, just briefly, Andre said something that was that one prayer led me, to open up and find God, and that was not what I said. It took months and months and months of transcendental meditation, but nothing worked. It was the one attempt just to have a conversation with God that it worked. It was totally just focused on God with no distractions. And that's, I just wanted to not mislead him.
Thank you very much. Obviously, his intention was good, but he simply didn't quite understand the
I wouldn't
complexity.
assume my intention was good, Neil.
Well, I think I should give you the benefit of the doubt,
Thank you.
sir.
That's kind.
All right.
And I stand corrected, Doreen. Thank you. There are two things that strike me. One is this idea of, we're thinking very much, not straight line, but we're thinking fairly conventionally. We ought to look at counterexample and almost null hypothesis in this regard as well. And in that regard, would say, well, like what else can lead a person to God? Well, so let's look at somebody like C.S. Lewis, who was an atheist, and we can all think of plenty of other atheists. And what can lead a person to God? And well, completely rejecting God intellectually, but sincerely being open to truth in some way is a path to God. And if one, with the caveat, of course, of sincerely looking for what the truth is. And so when we talk about, all men have these keys: sincerity, and more sincerity, decisions, and more decisions, regardless of how far off and how far in the opposite direction of the center one is going, that can end up being a path to God. I don't think I need to elaborate any more on that. The second thing has to do with Bob's original point concerning the superconscious. And, a lot of the concepts in the Urantia book did have a prior human origin. We know that, for instance, they wouldn't have been able to talk about evolution at all in the Urantia book had it not been for the evolution of the concept evolution, from being something in the early 1800s, simply meaning to unfurl your sails, to what it became in meaning progressive growth, and all of that. In the same way, superconscious did have an origin, or was propounded by Roberto Assagioli, the Italian psychiatrist who wrote the book Psychosynthesis. He did this in Italian initially. It was later translated. Psychosynthesis was one of his books, and The Act of Will was another one of his books. And what's interesting about that is that concept is a very, very important concept when we're talking about this idea of spiritual development. How much am I willing to accept would be some of the implications of this concept, that there is a great deal of creative process spiritually happening inside of me, above my awareness, above what I'm able to know. And can I have faith that that process is a good process, and do what I can to cooperate with that process? Wonderfully, Roberto Assagioli elucidated some of that in his writings. And I believe some of the time what the Urantia book is doing is providing itself as a doorway to be able to go look out at what was already there extant in the evolutionary stream of consciousness, that we can then go back to and learn what the richer form of those concepts might be by seeing where they came from.
Thank you. I believe that we've all had good opportunities to express a range of views. I see that Bob is looking for a third trip to the batter's box, and I guess I will accede to that, sir. Go ahead.
Well, thank you for the baseball metaphor, Neil. We are going to the World Series here in this area, so I want to just say that to everybody. But that really wasn't what I was going to say. Kindred minds, serendipitous. Oh my goodness! When Andre, you just brought up C.S. Lewis, I've got George MacDonald sitting here on Wikipedia. I asked myself that same question when I started to think about possible responses to this question. And I came up with C.S. Lewis. I went out to Wikipedia, did some research, and found out that the reason, the catalyst, according to Wikipedia anyway, and there's some pretty good references here, was the book by George MacDonald called Phantasies, and it was a story about fairies, believe it or not. Now, there's no explanation on Wikipedia as to why C.S. Lewis suddenly, and he says this in one of his books, I think the Screw Tape Letters, why it brought him back to God, but it did. So I'm sorry, I thought that was just way too serendipitous to not talk about. Thanks, Neil.
I appreciate that. And I really am going to have to draw a line now and proceed to the next section of the
Well, I
essay.
would love to hear what Steve has to say.
Well, I'm sorry. Did he motion that he wanted to add something? I didn't see you or your.
Yeah, very, very briefly, talk about serendipity. Andre also mentioned Roberto Assagioli and psychosynthesis. Now, this is the first time I've ever heard anybody in the Urantia world talk about Assagioli, except for my wife, who is also a reader and has studied Assagioli and actually worked on books on Assagioli for decades now. And she is totally blown away by how much of Assagioli's ideas and approach and sensibilities are embodied in the Urantia book. And of course, he lived during the same period that the Urantia book was indicted, the revelation was indicted. And so we'll never really know if there's any direct connection, but I just thought that was amazing that Andre brought that up.
Thank you. I have a group of colleagues who are very inventive and very imaginative, for which I am indeed quite grateful. But I now think that I am going to be allowed to direct the discussion onward to the next section of the paper, the section entitled The Religion of Personal Spiritual Experience. And I would like to call on my partner and close cooperator, Bob, to read that first paragraph, just the paragraph of text, and stop before we reach the quotation from paper 103. But anyway, just the text, please.
Will do, Neil. The religion of personal spiritual experience. It is abundantly obvious that the real religion of Jesus transcends the level of matter, even though matter is a crucial and necessary component of the trio of finite realities that provide a framework for personal experience on our planet Urantia, that is, matter, mind, and spirit. On the other hand, we cannot be equally categorical in appraising the degree to which the real religion of Jesus transcends the level of mind, even though the phrase, quote, personal spiritual experience, quote, if read strictly and literally, demonstrates that it does. The paradox that we cannot evade is that although spirit is not mind and most certainly transcends it, mind is nonetheless the channel for the expression of spirit in human experience. As a Melchizedek tells us, there is no alternative.
Thank you. I would like to go a little bit into the logic of this paragraph before I yield to the rest of you in commenting on it. It has long seemed to me that mind, the middle element in the group of three, matter, mind, and spirit, has not received enough attention in the tradition, nor indeed in the various faiths that we can broadly understand as Christianity. The conflict beginning with Darwin about evolution was, on the one hand, aimed at matter, and on the other hand, aimed at spirit, wherein the advocates of traditional religion attacked Darwin's theories based on matter as a violation of spirit. But neither side of that argument paid attention to the intermediate role of mind and why understanding how mind operates really illuminates the whole argument they were having. They did not see that. And indeed, in effect, I've now explained why At a later stage of my long document, Revelation Revealed, we have an entire topic, topic 11, devoted to mind. But let us talk about this in terms of the question of transcending. That spirit transcends mind, but it is still the channel for expressing spirit and human experience. Now, the quotation that we will read subsequently gives greater depth in this, but I would like to call for comments about my own personal thesis, namely that the realm of mind and the role of mind has not been adequately understood, even among readers of the Urantia book. Would you take that on, Andre?
A hardball, finally.
Well, at least it wasn't a curveball.
It wasn't a curveball. True enough. I think that's a very good aspect that you bring up to this discussion, and that is the idea of mind being the arena of choice is what we learn about in the Urantia book, and that is primarily how we make spiritual progress. But alongside that, of course, all the efforts that our thought adjuster is making in that realm. But clearly, even though we learn about things like the 7 adjutant mind spirits and the Holy Spirit and the cosmic mind and all these facets of mind that pertain to our progression, we don't really know how they all interact, and we haven't adequately studied these things. So again, it's interesting that, and I appreciate very much that Steve brought up that I would love to see what Steve's wife has come up with. That would be very, very interesting and gratifying. I think it's one of the most important things we can do is to study those kinds of things. And it bears directly on what we're talking about now, because what we typically focus on with regard to mind is its conscious aspects. You know, that's what it's like the proverbial metaphor of the guy who's looking for the keys under the lamp, and somebody says, what are you looking for? Well, I lost my keys. And somebody says, well, where did you lose them? Well, I lost them over there. Well, why are you looking here? This is where the light is. And you know, that typically that's true of our minds as well. We assume very much about ourselves, and it's an unfortunate aspect to ego, is that ego is always willing to think, if it's defined as in this very succinct way, as who we think we are, at any stage we always think we know who we are, even if we believe we're much more. We're willing to appropriate that as a good working hypothesis for who we are. And part of what we need to do with mind is to make it part of our ego awareness that we are much more than we think we are, and that much more than we think we are is not known by us. It is known by God. And that is a beginning in making use of mind correctly, I believe. The other way is to really get to know the adjutant mind spirits and what constitutes making our third circle in terms of unifying their function. I mean, we're told that that's part of what reaching the third circle is, and most people are not at the first circle in their development, but the third circle is quite attainable. And a lot of it has to do with balance and ratcheting up all those aspects of mind that we don't necessarily associate with who we are. For example, in my own case, I am not the most organized human being on earth. I would drive somebody nuts who was very organized if I was imposed on them as a roommate. My point in that is I have some first adjutant work to do. I haven't focused on first adjutant stuff as much as I have second adjutant stuff. I focused on a little bit more on third adjutant stuff, values and the kinds of things that are associated with the spirit of courage, but not nearly as much as I have with knowledge, which, you know, we focus on what comes a little more easily to us. And in the same way, as an extrovert, the adjutant of counsel was a more natural fit for me. The spirit of introversion, as I'll rename the spirit of worship, the spirit of reflection, they do refer to at some point, that required deliberate effort. And somehow I was led to move toward meditation, you know, at a younger age, but it's by no means natural. It's nothing I would naturally do on my own, other than however that happened, I was led that way. But what my point in saying all of that is, we all have those areas. They're different areas for all of us, but we're all called to reach that kind of balance that is the precursor to then surrendering all those things to Morancha mind progressively. And that's the only way that adjutant mind diminishes, as they say, you know, as we move toward the first circle. The only way that will happen is for us to get to a point where it's fully functioning, and they're functioning together and in a balanced fashion. So what you say about mind being important, I agree with wholeheartedly. That would be the long way of saying that.
Thank you. I would like now to give a variation on my question to Stephen with a bit of historical analysis blended in. In the Christian tradition, the role of mind has been very substantial. We have talked about the limitations of doctrine, the limitations of teachings, the limitations of uniformity. But having said all of that, it is true that the Christian tradition for approximately 2,000 years has fostered inquiry, analysis, thinking, philosophy, admittedly in a narrow field, directed toward religious inquiry and tradition. But nevertheless, this fostering of thinking really deserves to be understood as a function of mind, and yet mind itself was never identified as a channel and a component. Rather, it was effectively a tool that philosophers and theologians used in pursuing religious doctrine. Would you like to comment on this, Stephen?
That's pretty much exactly what I was going to talk about anyway.
Well, I'm not a mind reader, but I'm glad that we connect in some ways.
In the Jewish tradition, there is a being known as wisdom, who was one of the main attributes, divine attributes of God, was wisdom. And in the Hellenistic tradition, is also known as Sophia, as wisdom or the mind of God. Now, of course, Christ, who was also called the Logos, and Logos meaning communication or law or idea, Christ was understood to be the mind of God for human beings. Now, what does that mean? That means that Jesus represented the nature of God on earth. So in other words, he was the incarnation of God on earth. That was Logos. How did God? So the question was, for late Judaism and early Christianity, it was, how did God as a pure spiritual being, as a perfect being, communicate with fallible human beings? And the answer was wisdom, or the answer was the Logos. The answer was Jesus Christ as the Logos of God. And that became the very means by which Christianity felt comfortable talking about the nature of God, because Christ was the Logos. Christ communicated the nature of God to human beings. By knowing Christ, by knowing Jesus, you could know the Father. And therefore you could reason about him. You could use the tools of the mind to know God. And that was because Jesus incarnated the Logos of God. It's a very, very important insight into not only Christianity, but also Judaism. How do you communicate, or how does a perfect being communicate with imperfect human beings? And the answer is wisdom, Logos, Jesus, or Christ.
Thank you, Bob. I'd like to give another twist to this question, and I'm not sure whether you will regard it as a curveball or simply a fast pitch, as Andre said recently. The problem we have with mind in understanding the teachings of the Urantia book is partly related to the tendency in the literary or dictionary tradition of regarding mind as simply being abstract logic ideas, whereas the revelators give a much broader definition of mind, in effect depicting mind as the entire realm of human consciousness. They talk about other varieties of mind, but at least that is the impression I have of the revelators' description of human mind. So now if you could please talk about the relationship of mind as an embodiment of all phases of human consciousness as the second element of this trio, matter, mind, and spirit.
Okay. Well, I think Andre started with all of that when he brought up the adjutant mind spirits. You may be referring to this concept, this either Brahmin or Buddhist or Indian, or I shouldn't say Indian, I should say Hindu concept about the Akashic records as being, containing all information that is passed through humans in history. I think one of the things that the Urantia Papers has done for me has been to present me the theme that mind is not the brain. And as I was studying the Urantia Papers in the late 80s or so, and we sort of attended reading sessions almost every Tuesday for maybe 15 years or so, getting through the papers. At one point, I have to say, this is kind of a funny story. I was sitting on the Beltway trying to get home. Of course, traffic, around this area is still as bad as it has been in the past. I was coming up to the Woodrow Wilson Bridge and traveling a couple miles an hour. And in those days, I used to have a book and I would actually read while I was in traffic. I wouldn't recommend that to anybody these days, but that's what I did. And I was reading about iconoclastic sort of scientists, and I came across this Rupert Sheldrake, who I think somehow divined with his ideas of morphic resonance and morphic fields the adjutant mind spirits. I'd always had sort of wondered and hadn't found at that point, because the internet wasn't really that strong, or may not have even been there when I was doing this, that there was something else beyond the brain, some sort of field. And of course, if we read the early parts of the papers and the discussion of the third source and center, and how mind comes all the way down to the creative mother spirit at each of the local universes, who then presents that form of cosmic mind, or I should say that attenuation of cosmic mind into the local universe with the creator sun. So the adjutant mind spirits are really a derivative of all that. They do condition material evolution, and then of course the life at that point, once it gets beyond mechanical mind, to actually foster organic life in the form for that particular local universe. I'm saying a lot here, really thinking a lot. So go back to the story when I was on the Beltway, and Sheldrake has come up with these ideas about morphic fields and morphic resonance. His idea has been labeled as books to be burned in current society. This is not a concept that will reach conventional thought. I'm so glad Andre went through some ideas of his own to say that he needs to be able to improve on certain levels of the adjuvants. I hadn't really thought about that for my own personal self, but it's something that we should really contemplate. But you have to know that first. I mean, you have to know that, you have to get that by faith, and you have to agree that this is what's going on in our local universe. And to try to foster some of these ideas, such as Sheldrake has. I'm not sure that an idea like that would really take root unless the Urantia papers had really taken root, because you have to begin to extrapolate way beyond where we are with what we think mind is. So yes, Neil, I totally agree. Mind has gotten the short shrift in all science, evolution, etc. So much so that science thinks that ideas like Sheldrake has are ideas that ought to be, they should be burning as books. So mind is a terrible thing to waste. We need to focus quite a bit more on that, and the third source and center, of course, provides it's the infinite part that is all over the place with all of our celestial helpers. A lot to be done here. Over.
Thank you. I would comment as a corollary to part of what you just said. The current preoccupation of scientists who study the brain includes the question of determining which particular part of the brain originates certain kinds of thoughts. And this is part of the very materialistic spin that, in effect, you're talking about. Whereas we know that the brain is the physical vehicle, but it is not mind. It is a human organism that allows mind to communicate with the body. And that's not a rigorous definition, but it certainly expresses the reality much better than the traditional scientific viewpoint that is the consensus for people who condemned Sheldrake's books. Doreen, I'd like you.
Neil,
yes.
Just one final thought on that I didn't say, but I was kind of thinking as I was formulating the thought. The idea of the superconscious has to occur in the brain at some, the brain has to be attuned to be able to work with the mind field, the adjutant, cosmic mind with the adjutant spirits. So there's a huge process going on here that is going to require a lot of further study and a lot of evidence before we really understand how some of this operates. But the superconscious is one that we brought up today, and we should probably make note of that.
Thank you. Doreen, I'd like you to comment on the components of mind in human experience, the paradox that I mentioned earlier, that the brain or the mind is normally, or most frequently, I guess I should say, understood to be abstract thinking, whereas the revelators describe it as the entire framework of human experience, therefore including all sorts of reactions that people might be inclined to call emotions or quick perception. How do you deal with all of this?
Wow, I've studied them for decades because I've had tremendous experiences, I would say, in that level of superconscious reality. There is reality and there's non-reality. And of course, you have to interpret it through your material mind. But many of the things took place in the soul. But whoever I think, said something about resonance. Well, one of my first experiences very early on, I was meditating and all of a sudden I hear the sound, and it was like an engine of a plane taking off, and it was revving up louder and louder and louder, and then boom, I just popped right out, and I could see myself lying there on the, on the sofa. And I'm looking down, and I really got scared because I started praying. Oh my God, it was like you were a rubber band and I'm bouncing around. And thereafter, I've had many other experiences like that, but then it was more balanced. And I saw myself, I saw the body lying there, and I saw all these atoms. I would say it had to be atoms, molecules. I don't know how to interpret it, like a stream coming into my body. And I thought that's probably the life force. That's me. But that's when I knew that life exists really outside. I was fully intact in my mind. I understood, I could see, I could think, I had judgment. And you get to adapt to these experiences, but it made so much sense to me that because I had always read, you're not attached to the body, the brain is, the mind is separate. And I read many books on it and spoke to many people who were amazing. Nevertheless, beyond that, the understanding of what takes place in the soul, that's revealed to you. How do you interpret that? And I really did struggle. I struggled for a long time trying to know what, and this is all done, I was going to say, through the approach to God. The greater reality, the more love you have, and the more love I had for God, the more I wanted to grow towards God. And I continually asked him to challenge me, and I didn't have to say too much because I was continually challenged for sure. But it grew me, even though I suffered and I agonized over many of the experiences, but I did understand some of the things that they were trying to work with me, or he was, whoever, doesn't matter. I understand that I would say not too long ago, and for me, it's easier to talk about experiences because that's how I understand it than to intellectualize about them. Because I had to do that to understand what does God want from me, and how am I going to do his will, and what is it, where am I going? And it was a battle, with my thoughts to keep them from resisting to defend myself against negative people. And it was such an impulse, to say, well, I don't see it this way, and blah, blah, blah. And all of a sudden, I started to get this, it's like, oh, it's so hard. And I know it's hard to believe, but it's always been there. This impression, let's call it an impression. And I always thought maybe it's the outside of me, the spirit, but I think it was probably the thought adjuster trying to adjust my thoughts, saying, don't go there. And that's, these are the issues that when you kind of try to tune in with, the higher, your higher spiritual realm and your material mind, it's easy to adapt to what you've done all your life and right away respond, because we're chemical beings and we have to have an answer to everything. But it was a few years ago, and I started to realize it, that what is it you want from me? And the second I started to change my thoughts, it stopped the impression on my mind. I would say on my scalp. It's always on my head where they touch me, or from inside. That's how I understand it. Anyway, and I sort of realized the connection. Of course, you want to grow towards God. God wouldn't say anything. Jesus never had to defend himself like that. Not really, I would say most of the time. And it was not necessary. And that's what I think I was being given, that message, not to go there. And it was continually, anytime my mind automatically wanted to go and say something to someone who maybe demeaned someone else, and I thought that is not acceptable, because no God conscious, but I'm talking about your aunt readers as well. No God conscious person would talk to other people or say terrible things, about other people. And it just is so incongruent to what we're trying to achieve in this, in the revelation, on the planet, to make it a better world. And how do we do that? So the indicator, is saying to me that don't go there. And every time I stop going there, I take my mind, and Jesus said, if you don't like your mind, exchange your mind for his. Put it on positive thoughts. And normally I do, but sometimes you're up against some real, real challenges, and it doesn't matter. And God, and my thought adjuster is saying to me, it doesn't matter. Don't go there anyway. It only takes the energy down. It only degrades people, and degrades yourself because you get upset. Don't do it. And the second I stop that thinking, and this is not verbal, I'm just talking about my own thoughts in my own head, they stop going like that, touching me. It stops automatically. And I thank them, and I thank God for reminding me over and over again. So there's things that happen in our soul. How do I translate it? It is very challenging to understand the connection between, spiritual mind and material mind. Very difficult. And I've had all kinds of opportunities, but God has humbled me. He has really taken me to the cleaners, I would say, many, many times until I got it. And once I got it, I understood that's what you had to do to get through to me. It's not easy to take, and I said last time, animal mind, but that material level of thinking that is so normal on this planet, it is not easy. When you desire to be better than that, then you really have to put the effort in to understand the way. And the way he has designed for me is probably different from 100,000 million other people, but that's how I connect with the Spirit of God in the soul, and then interpret it, which is frustrating in my mind. And if that answers something that you asked me, I hope, but I know it's all through love. And it's because I love God, and I know without a second doubt in my mind that he loves me and he wants me to succeed, because like I said one time before, failure of the thought adjuster one more time is not where it's going to happen. So I know he's pushing me as hard as he can.
Thank you. I think once again, your comments illuminate this idea of focus. And indeed, the role of the mind, the role of the brain in relation to the mind, the role of the mind in relation to the spirit is certainly partly a matter of focus. It's not limited by the question of focus, but focusing can help us understand it much better. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we are just about at the 2-hour mark. I would simply like to put the quotation on the record and ask perhaps that this one paragraph from paper 103 be read. It starts at the bottom of page 2 and carries over into the first 4 lines of page 3. Stephen, would you be willing to read that quotation for us, please? You're muted.
I lost track of where you're coming from here.
Just the quotation in the blue box that starts at the bottom of page 2. Always must man's inner spirit, etc.
I think you're going to have to ask somebody else. I've lost my place.
All right, fine. Bob, would you be willing to read the quotation, please?
Sure. Always must man's inner spirit depend for its expression and self-realization upon the mechanism and technique of the mind. Likewise must man's outer experience of material reality be predicated on the mind consciousness of the experiencing personality. Therefore are the spiritual and the material, the inner and the outer human experiences always correlated with the mind function and conditioned as to their conscious realization by the mind activity. Man experiences matter in his mind. He experiences spiritual reality in the soul, but becomes conscious of this experience in his mind. The intellect is the harmonizer and the ever-present conditioner and qualifier of the sum total of mortal experience. Both energy things and spirit values are colored by their interpretation through the mind media of consciousness. And Melchizedek from paper 103, section 6, paragraph 6.
Thank you. And as indicated at the very end of that quotation on the page, I have highlighted one particular sentence by printing it in bold in the text. And the first half of that sentence that I highlighted in bold reads as follows: man experiences matter in his mind. I would submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, that that sentence by itself overcomes the entirely materialistic approach that we human beings are still struggling with. Man experiences matter in his mind. In other words, there is a definite, necessary link between matter and man's perception of it that occurs in the mind, that man cannot experience matter materially. Man has to experience matter mindily. Now, Andre, would you like to take a look at that particular thought?
Well, it makes sense to me, and I would assume to all of us, given that there's a reality of mind that we're looking at. The question is that something that needs to be proven? Is it something that needs to be taken as an a priori assumption about life? You know, I've puzzled about this idea of science positing the idea of mind as only being the brain and its mechanical function as a difficult nut to crack with people. And it makes me wonder whether or not in getting to a concept of the reality of mind as a reality that stands alone, away from a material foundation in the brain, whether or not this is something that needs to be believed, or is it something that can be demonstrated? You know,
I think
for
you're
those who
asking.
believe, it can be demonstrated, but is that only a function of belief, or is it really demonstrable? I would end this with a question for myself.
I think you are indeed asking very important questions. They relate to part of what Bob said earlier about the theories of the scientist whose name I believe is Sheldrake. And in effect, my interest in this question has to do with the concept of overcoming the collision, supposedly, between spirit and matter, or perhaps I should say the proponents of a religious view of spirit with matter. If we see mind as an independent reality in between, it overcomes a great deal of the collision, because mind is the channel for both. By implication, that is what the Melchizedek is saying in this paragraph. Bob, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I that's why I brought up Sheldrake. Andre, I believe that if you take a look at what Sheldrake has done in the last 15 or 18 years or so that I've known this, you know, he's written some books like, you know, Why Your Dog Knows When You're Coming Home. You know, it's the title of the book. But his ideas on morphic resonance, which is more toward the evolution, matter evolution side. He sees these forms, which he just, you know, which he posited as conditioning evolution, and in fact builds up the habits, God's habits, so to speak, in in the universe, on the side of God the Almighty, I suppose. So there is a way to get data. Whether one believes it or not is another another thought. Well, I guess that's all I could say right now, Neil. I think that there's probably a lot to be said. We are running a tad late, but the spiritual reality in the soul, the soul is our mid-mind, of course, and it's got a couple functions. One is that it's going to be a substance, and the other one is it's building the relationship between the thought adjuster and our mind. So I'll leave it at that. More to talk about again. Oh, and I got something from Steve here on the chat. Steve, can I read this? A book that addresses the question of mind and materiality is Thomas Nagel's Mind in the Cosmos: Why the Materialistic Neo-Darwinian Conception of Nature is Almost Certainly False. I started reading that a while back, believe it or not. One of my colleagues pointed me to Nagel. He's currently a professor at New York University, I believe. So very contemporary book. The Akashic records are getting bigger, I suppose. Over.
Thank you. I would offer the opportunity to Stephen and Doreen to comment at this point if they wish, but the assurance that I will also specify is that we are going to return to this paragraph, this quotation from paper 103, when we have our next webinar. So they are not obliged to exhaust their fund of wisdom at this particular moment. They will have another opportunity. I appreciate Stephen's identification of that book and that author. So do either of you wish to speak at this point? Doreen?
Sure. And I'll just be very brief. And I remember a book that was called As a Man Thinketh, So Is He. And I remember that said, you're the director of your mind. You create what you want to see, what you believe is real. You manifest it. And when your indwelling spirit and the material mind align with the spirit of truth in the soul, enforced by the divine mother spirit, we are able to grasp the higher spiritual values. And I will stop there and save it for next time.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I will commend the extremely interesting discussion. I believe we have examined in great depth and with considerable wisdom, taking Stephen's word, these questions that are complicated and indeed rewarding. So I look forward very much to the next time. I should state, for the benefit of any of you who may have forgotten, but emphatically for the benefit of our viewers, that it will be 2 weeks before we are able to gather again, namely the 2nd of November, on which we are bound to have a very interesting discussion. So thank you once again, ladies and gentlemen. Goodbye.
Hey, everybody.
Just be with you all.